Our next candidate, Glenn Tickner, came all the way from Nampa, Idaho to be with us this evening. After attending MPC in 1953 and 54, Mr. Tickner attended UC Berkeley and Stanford University. His extensive contributions to scientific and medical communities are difficult to summarize and are an inspiration to the present and future MPC students. Clearly, if you start at MPC, you can go on to achieve anything you dream of. Folks, let's give a warm welcome to Glenn Tickner as he makes his way to the stage.
I'm tall and the microphone's low. Sorry. Can you hear me in the back? Yes. Okay. First of all, it's an honor to be here and be selected for this honorable and very thankful to receive it. And I would like to pass on some thoughts that I have concerning MPC, and if you'll forgive me, a little bit of my life. I spent almost 50 years as a biomedical engineer, and I started, and I was the first one of four that started bioengineering. So I'll get into that. But I first of all want to go back to my time at MPC. And I was grateful because I had two sterling instructors, DeHart and Seibel, that taught me critical thinking as part of just everyday classwork. But it was something that finally filtered inside of me, and probably took a few years before I understood what it really meant. I would like to get into that, but only as an end point of view. I graduated from MPC. I went to Cal Berkeley, as you heard, and I was rather fortunate. And when I first of all, at that time at Cal, there was civil engineering, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, and mining engineering, and that was it. Now, there's bioengineering and other engineering. So there's been changes made in the university system, and I like to think that I had a small part to play in that. While I was at UC Berkeley, I just, by circumstance, ended up with a fantastic prof who is in charge of the water wave research lab. Well, I was studying fluid mechanics, so it fit perfectly to what I wanted to do as an undergraduate and as a graduate student. So I spent 3 years doing that and became a pseudo-expert in water waves. It turned out when I graduated that Lockheed had great need for somebody that knew water waves. It seems, and this is just a rumor, mind you, but it seems as if they were making a dummy missile, the Polaris missile, in conjunction with Westinghouse, which was making the submarine that housed the missile. They took the dummy missile, the dummy submarine off of Catalina Island someplace and launched it, and the water wave forces turned the missile around and it bombed the dummy submarine. Well, I don't know why, but the admirals took umbrage at this. Imagine shooting down your own submarine with a nuclear warhead. So they decided they needed to hire somebody that knew about water waves, and so that was my first professional job outside of the water wave research, was part of graduate school. And I worked for 1 year, and this gets into my personal philosophy, but as I worked there for that 1 year, you hear about the Polaris missile, and it's a mega kill device. It didn't sink into me at first, but at the end of 1 year, I was suffering from the beginning signs of ulcers, and I finally realized when you're dealing with this type of business, in this business, there's really two items, both honorable. One, the Polaris missile is a weapon or it is a deterrent. Now, most people think of it as a deterrent, but obviously I thought of it as a weapon. I had to leave there. I wanted to spend my life helping mankind, not killing it. And that was a philosophical thing I went through after my first year out of graduate school. It turned out that a very good friend of mine, turned out to be a very good friend of mine, acquaintance at the time, had just formed a company that was engineering oriented, a think tank for engineers, physicists, chemists, and that type of thing. So I hired in there doing some of the stuff you read about in the brochure. But that wasn't the main reason why I was there. Now, I'm going to come back to this, but I now want to transfer you to another story, if the microphone will last. I want to place you in the office or in a meeting room at Ames Research Center. I believe this meeting was the beginning of bioengineering as we now know it. The meeting was headed by Dr. Harold Sandler, a physician. He was in charge of the test pilot's health pre-post test flights. And this was before man was in space. And in this meeting, he called all the heads of the various medical type of people that were involved. And he started the meeting, wrapping his baton and getting there to be quiet. Says, I call this meeting here to talk about something new and different in your and our lives. First of all, I want you all to know that it's now final. We're going to put man in space. That's a long time ago, but that's what happened. And immediately, everybody in the room stood up and applauded. They've been reading about it and hearing rumors and stuff like that, and now this was reality. And he said there's three elements in this, what we have to be done regarding the health of astronauts. Pre-flight, in-flight, post-flight. Pre-flight, post-flight, forget about. It's not your business, it's mine. I already have physicians that take care of that. But in-flight is your problem. Now, you're on the wall and you're listening to all this and you're saying, uh-oh, here, what are we going to be doing? He turned around to the chalkboard and he had chalk in his hand and says, all right, what's the first thing we're going to measure an astronaut in space? Somebody said temperature, so he wrote it on the board. Heart rate, blood pressure, breathing rate. And he started down this line and he stopped and he pointed to everybody around the room, just like this. And he walked up to the board and he underlined blood pressure. And he said, what is the blood pressure? How do you measure it? Dr. Williams stood up and said, well, it's called the auscultatory process, where you put a cuff on the arm, got a stethoscope downstream or downstream of the cuff, and you pressurize the cuff and you listen to sounds. It's tapping sounds. He says, that's right. It's called the auscultatory process. What's going on in the cuff? The room was as silent as this room is right now. Nobody knew. They didn't know what was going on in the cuff. Here I am, being dramatic again. So nobody knew the answer. He says, well, how do we know? He says, first of all, whatever's causing it, says, question number 2, is it gravity dependent? Zero-G environment, You could be measuring the blood pressure. Nobody knew the answer. Well, it turned out, to get back to my old company, that Sandler was a good friend of my boss. And somehow this company got a contract to study the auscultatory process in a model. And I just transferred into that group. So I became one of the first bioengineers in the history of the world. Engineers like making models. Thank you. They like making models. You've heard about make models of airplanes and stick them in a wind tunnel. They can predict the prototype things. Well, we can do that with the blood pressure. We did it. We made the artery was not a quarter of an inch. It was 1 inch in diameter. So we get all the tubes and stuff and make the pressure measurements and things like that. Our cuff was lucite, clear. So we shot a bright light below it. There were rubber tubes represent the artery, brachial artery, and we did our studies. And we found out the cause of it. Do you want to know what it was? You won't understand it. It's called a dynamic instability. So what is that? What is dynamic instability? You know, you've seen it millions of times, probably every one of you. Not exactly the same one, but it works the same way, and that's a flag on a flagpole on a windy day. At the flagpole, the flag is hardly moving, but the tip of it sometimes makes sounds. A wave propagates out because it's unstable to the end of this flag. Same thing happens under the cuff. The collapsed brachial artery, when the pulse comes along, it's slightly greater than the pressure cuff. The cuff opens up a little bit, this pulse goes through, amplifies, accelerates to the far end. At the far end, what happens? The collapsed artery. That's what's going on. You're hearing the artery. Well, that's pretty nice. We now know the cause of it. Is it gravity dependent? Well, the engineers came to the rescue again, my colleagues and myself. And we found out, no, it's not gravity dependent. So they could measure the blood pressure of an astronaut in space exactly like they do here in the lab. That started the bioengineering, because what happens? Well, you needed to know the characteristics of arteries. I tested arteries. You need to know the properties of blood. I tested blood, tested muscle tissue, etc. And this spread out over the years, and other schools, academic institutions started doing likewise. So bioengineering, in those days we were called the biomedical engineers, but bioengineering started at that time, and I credit Dr. Harold Stanler by starting it. Now, I spent a number of years doing that type of stuff, but it turned out that wasn't the major thing that I did. My major contribution was microbubbles. Way back there. You want to know what a microbubble is, don't you? Okay, I'll tell you. It's a bubble, but it's a little tiny bubble. How tiny is it? Well, 25 of them side by side is equal to a diameter of hair in your head. That's pretty small. And the bubble has a shell around it. Now, I started on this in 1976, spent the rest of my life working on microbubbles, and I was bound and determined to make a precise microbubble. I wanted to make billions of them, all precise in size, for the particular project I was working on. I failed. I couldn't do it. So how does MPC relate to that? Critical thinking. What do you do with a failure? You've got to start thinking about it. And that's when it occurred to me, and my first patent, was ultrasonic contrast, because a little bubble or a bigger bubble all echo if you use ultrasound. What is ultrasound? Ultrasound is a transducer, sends out a pressure wave, and that pressure wave strikes a surface in the body, in the case of a heart. Same kind of ultrasound tells you whether a woman, whether her child is male or female, can look at the heart. And that ultrasound then goes into the body. If there's a bubble there, a bubble's compressible. Sound waves are pressure waves. And so the bubble oscillates. And it then is a backscatterer. You can see where the blood is, because the blood carries the bubbles throughout the body. And so that was the basic elements of my life. And for that type of, mainly because of that study, which is the bulk of my lifetime work, last year I was awarded Who's Who, Marquis Who. So I'm in a book with George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and all those amazing people. Now, I just want to get close to the closing here and tell you from somebody that was on the front lines, and that is, think of a wall, and the vertical, as you go up on the wall, it's knowledge. At the bottom is what a baby knows. And there's all these disciplines. There's music and art and medicine and bioengineering and astronomy, etc. And those people that work as what I had done, trying to elevate man's knowledge, go from known to unknown. And there's tons of failures that take place. And you have to learn to adapt to that. How do you do that? Critical thinking. And that takes me right back to MPC, where I learned it. I'm grateful to MPC because rudiments of what is inside of me was presented to me at that time. Thank you all.